You're about to experience The Whitmore Aberations, an original short story from Setfri. Discover more captivating short stories at setfri.com.
The fog that shrouded London on that accursed morning of November the 15th possessed a quality most peculiar, one which even now, as I set these words to paper, fills me with an unaccountable dread. It clung to the cobblestones of Baker Street with a tenacity that seemed almost malevolent, and through our lodging's windows, the gaslight appeared to struggle against a darkness that was more than mere absence of illumination. I had risen early, as was my custom, to find Holmes already seated in his leather chair, his aquiline features sharp with concentration as he examined what appeared to be a telegram through his magnifying glass. The morning papers lay scattered about his feet, their headlines proclaiming the usual dreary catalogue of London's misfortunes. Yet something in his posture suggested that our quiet morning was about to be most rudely interrupted. "Watson," said he, without raising his eyes from his examination, "pray tell me, in your medical experience, have you ever encountered a case where a man might age 30 years in the span of a single evening?" I set down my coffee cup with perhaps more force than was necessary. "Holmes, surely you jest. Such a thing is physiologically impossible. The human body simply cannot." "Cannot what, my dear fellow?" "Cannot do what it has demonstrably done?" His gray eyes fixed upon me with that peculiar intensity I had come to associate with his most challenging cases. "Inspector Lestrade awaits us in Whitmore, Watson. It seems that Lord Pemberton, a man of merely 43 years, was discovered this morning in his locked study, transformed into what witnesses describe as a decrepit ancient, his hair white as winter frost, his face carved with wrinkles that spoke of decades he had never lived to see. The very notion was preposterous, yet Holmes's expression brooked no argument. I had learned, through our many adventures together, to trust his judgment even when it led us down the most improbable of paths. "When do we depart?" I asked, reaching for my medical bag. "The next train leaves in 20 minutes, Holmes replied, folding the telegram with mechanical precision. "I have already arranged for a cab." As we descended into the fog-shrouded street, I could not shake the sensation that we were embarking upon something far more sinister than our usual investigations. The very air seemed to whisper of horrors yet to be revealed, and I found myself thinking of those dark tales my grandmother used to tell, stories of things that lurked beyond the veil of rational understanding. Whitmore lay nestled in the Surrey countryside, like a pustule upon otherwise healthy flesh. Where London's fog had been merely thick, here the very air seemed to press against us with tangible weight, carrying scents of decay that had nothing to do with autumn's natural decomposition. The village itself appeared untouched by the industrial progress that had transformed so much of our fair nation, its medieval structures huddled together as if seeking protection from some unnamed threat. The train station bore signs of recent neglect that struck me as oddly purposeful. Fresh paint peeled from surfaces that should have weathered gradually, and the station master's movements possessed a mechanical quality that spoke of actions performed without conscious thought. Most disturbing of all, not a single bird could be seen or heard, as if the very wildlife had fled some approaching catastrophe. Inspector Lestrade met us at the platform, his usually ruddy complexion pale as parchment, his hands trembling slightly as he lit his pipe. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he greeted us with evident relief. "I confess, gentlemen, that this case has me thoroughly perplexed. In 20 years of police work, I have never encountered anything quite like it." "Pray enlighten us, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice betraying none of the curiosity I knew burned within him. "Your telegram was rather sparse in its details." As we made our way through streets that seemed to twist in directions that defied the village's actual geography, the inspector related the particulars of the case. Lord Pemberton had been discovered that morning by his housekeeper, Mrs. Whitlock, when she brought his customary morning tea. She had found the study door locked from within, as was his lordship's habit when conducting his research into what he termed antiquarian matters. "The curious thing, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade continued, glancing nervously at windows that reflected no light despite the overcast sky, "is that Mrs. Whitlock insists she heard his lordship speaking to someone throughout the night. Yet when we forced the door, he was quite alone." "Speaking to someone?" Holmes's interest sharpened perceptibly. "Could she make out the nature of this conversation?" "She claims it sounded like a lecture, sir, as if his lordship were reading aloud from some text, occasionally pausing as though someone were asking questions. But the responses..." Lestrade's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She swears the responses came in a voice that belonged to no human throat. We had reached the gates of Pemberton Hall, wrought iron barriers whose decorative elements seemed to shift and writhe when viewed peripherally. The mansion itself rose before us like a cancer of stone and timber, its Gothic architecture somehow more pronounced than such buildings typically appeared, as if someone had taken the concept of medieval menace and refined it to its absolute essence. Mrs. Whitlock proved to be a woman of perhaps 50 years, though her movements suggested someone far older. Her gray hair, pulled back in a severe bun, seemed to have whitened recently, and her black dress spoke of mourning that extended beyond mere social convention. She led us through corridors where portraits watched our progress, with eyes that seemed to track our movement, their subjects bearing the unmistakable Pemberton features: sharp cheekbones, deep-set eyes, and thin lips that suggested generations of carefully guarded secrets. His lordship had been acting strangely since acquiring those books from the Ashworth estate sale. She informed us as we climbed stairs that creaked with sounds resembling whispered warnings. Yorkshire folk, the Ashworths were, with a reputation for delving into matters best left alone. When their line died out last month, his lordship insisted on personally examining their library before it went to auction. The study itself defied my expectations entirely. Where I had anticipated the typical scholar's retreat, we found a space that seemed to exist in defiance of the building's outer dimensions. The ceiling soared to impossible heights, lost in shadows that gathered despite the afternoon light streaming through windows that appeared larger from within than their external proportions could accommodate. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, their contents ranging from standard historical works to volumes whose very presence seemed to lower the temperature of the room. A great oak desk dominated the center, its surface covered with papers written in Lord Pemberton's increasingly erratic hand, and scattered among them were books that made me deeply uncomfortable merely to observe. Holmes immediately set to work, his trained eye cataloging every detail with mechanical precision. I found myself drawn to the volumes that lay open upon the desk, one bound in what appeared to be blackened leather, bearing the title De Vermis Mysterious in lettering that seemed to shimmer and fade when viewed directly. Another, its pages yellowed with age beyond any natural process, contained text in a script that resembled no earthly language, though certain symbols within it appeared to writhe and shift when glimpsed peripherally. "Watson," Holmes called, his voice carrying an edge I had rarely heard before. "Observe this carefully." I found him kneeling beside the chair where Lord Pemberton had been discovered. The chair itself appeared unremarkable, but the Persian carpet surrounding it bore stains that formed a perfect geometric pattern. Each mark was precisely equidistant from the chair's position, creating a mandala of discoloration that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. The stains themselves possessed a color I had never before encountered, a shade that shifted between deep purple and absolute black, as if they absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "Most curious," Holmes murmured, producing his magnifying glass. "The pattern suggests deliberate placement, yet the substance that created these marks." He paused, his brow furrowing with concentration. "Watson, in your medical training, did you ever encounter anything that might produce such discolorations?" I knelt beside him, fighting against a growing sense of unease as I examined the strange marks more closely. A faint odor emanated from them, sweet yet cloying, that reminded me unpleasantly of decomposition accelerated far beyond natural processes. Nothing in conventional medicine could account for this, Holmes. The precision of the pattern suggests some form of ritual or ceremony, but the nature of these stains defies classification. Indeed, he rose, his expression troubled in a way that made my stomach clench with apprehension. "Lestrade, has the body been removed?" "Taken to Dr. Hartwell in the village for examination, sir. Though I must warn you, the good doctor seemed quite disturbed by what he observed." As we prepared to depart, I noticed Holmes, casting a final glance at the open books upon Lord Pemberton's desk. Something in his expression suggested recognition, a possibility that filled me with considerable unease. For if Holmes, with his vast knowledge and rational mind, found cause for concern in those forbidden pages, what horrors might they contain for ordinary mortals such as myself? Dr. Hartwell's surgery occupied the ground floor of a Tudor cottage, whose timber beams bore carvings that seemed older than the building itself. The elderly physician who greeted us carried himself with the careful movements of a man who had recently encountered something that challenged every assumption he held about the natural world. His hands trembled as he struggled to light his pipe, and his eyes possessed that hollow quality I had observed in soldiers returning from particularly brutal campaigns. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice quavering despite obvious efforts to maintain professional composure, "in 40 years of medical practice I have witnessed birth, death, disease, and trauma in all their myriad forms. Yet what lies upon my examination table contradicts every principle of human physiology I have ever studied." He led us to a small chamber that served as his morgue, where Lord Pemberton's remains lay beneath a white sheet that seemed somehow insufficient to contain whatever lay beneath. With obvious reluctance, Dr. Hartwell drew back the covering, revealing a sight that would haunt my dreams for years to come. The transformation was absolute. Lord Pemberton's hair had not merely whitened but had grown to lengths that should have required years to achieve, cascading from his scalp in silver waves that pooled around his head like spilled mercury. His skin bore the deep lines and liver spots of advanced age, yet possessed a translucent quality that revealed the network of veins beneath. Most disturbing were his fingernails, yellowed and elongated into curved talons that spoke of decades of growth compressed into mere hours. "The cellular structure," Dr. Hartwell continued, his medical training overcoming his obvious distress, "shows complete deterioration consistent with natural aging, yet accomplished in a time frame that renders such deterioration impossible. His organs have failed in the precise sequence one would expect in a man of advanced years, but the rapidity of the process defies every known biological principle." Holmes circled the examination table with predatory grace, his sharp eyes recording every detail. "Were there any signs of violence? Chemical burns? Evidence of external causation?" "None whatsoever. However," Dr. Hartwell's voice faltered and he glanced nervously between Holmes and myself, "there is one aspect of this case that I hesitate to mention for fear of being thought mad." "Pray speak freely, Doctor," Holmes encouraged. "In matters such as these, no observation is too insignificant. When I first examined the body, I could have sworn that Lord Pemberton's lips were moving, as if he were attempting to speak. Mind you, he had been deceased for several hours by that point. I attributed it to post-mortem muscle contractions, yet the movement seemed purposeful, as if he were trying to communicate something of vital importance. I felt the temperature in the room drop several degrees, though whether this was real or merely the product of my increasingly unsettled state of mind, I could not determine. Holmes, however, appeared fascinated rather than disturbed by this revelation. "Did you happen to discern what he might have been attempting to say?" "It sounds preposterous, but I could have sworn he was repeating a single phrase, over and over again. Something that sounded like, 'The threshold weakens, the gate opens wide.' Though what significance such words might possess, I cannot imagine." The effect of these words upon Holmes was immediate and alarming. His face went ashen, and for a moment his carefully maintained composure cracked entirely. I had never seen my friend display such obvious distress, and the sight filled me with a dread that seemed to seep into my very bones. "Holmes," I said, placing a steadying hand upon his arm, "are you quite well?" He recovered himself with visible effort, though his hands trembled slightly as he returned his notebook to his pocket. "Quite well, Watson. Dr. Hartwell, I thank you for your thoroughness. Might I prevail upon you to preserve the body for additional examination? I fear this case may require investigative methods that extend beyond conventional procedure." As we departed the physician's surgery, I could not help but notice that Holmes seemed to have aged in the span of minutes. His usually confident stride had become hesitant, and his sharp eyes now held depths of knowledge I wished he had never acquired. "Holmes," I ventured as we made our way back through the village streets, "you recognize that phrase, did you not?" He remained silent for so long that I began to wonder if he had heard my question. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Watson, throughout my career I have prided myself on the application of rational thought to even the most seemingly impossible circumstances. I have always maintained that there exists no mystery so complex that it cannot be unraveled through careful observation and logical deduction. Yet what we have encountered today challenges every foundation upon which I have built my understanding of reality itself." The afternoon light was fading as we approached Pemberton Hall once more, and I noticed that the shadows cast by the building's towers seemed to fall in directions that bore no relationship to the sun's position. More disturbing still, those shadows appeared to be moving independently of any celestial motion, creeping across the landscape like living things seeking prey. That phrase, Watson, I have encountered it before, in texts that no rational man should read, in volumes that chronicle knowledge humanity was never meant to possess. If I am correct in my suspicions, then Lord Pemberton's death represents merely the opening movement of a symphony whose final notes will herald the end of the world as we understand it. 3 days passed before the second death manifested its horror upon Whitmore. 3 days, during which Holmes paced our hotel room like a caged predator, filling notebook after notebook with calculations and diagrams that grew increasingly incomprehensible with each passing hour. His usual methodical approach to investigation had given way to something approaching desperation, as if he sensed some cosmic clock counting down toward an unthinkable conclusion. The summons came at dawn on the 4th day, delivered by a constable whose uniform hung upon his frame as if he had lost considerable weight in recent hours. His message was brief but sufficient to confirm Holmes's darkest fears. Mrs. Margaret Blackwood, the village librarian, had been discovered in circumstances identical to Lord Pemberton's demise. "The pattern begins to reveal itself," Holmes muttered as we hastily dressed for the journey to the library. 2 deaths, both victims intimately connected to the written word, both transformed by forces that operate according to laws we have yet to comprehend. The Whitmore Public Library occupied a structure that predated the Norman conquest, its stone walls bearing inscriptions in languages that medieval scholars had attributed to wandering monks, but which closer examination revealed to be far older than any Christian presence in Britain. As we approached, I noticed that the morning mist clung to the building's foundations with unnatural persistence, refusing to dissipate despite the strengthening sun. Mrs. Blackwood's transformation exceeded even Lord Pemberton's in its horrible completeness. Where he had aged into decrepitude, she had become something that challenged the very definition of humanity. Her hair had not merely whitened, but had taken on a texture resembling spun glass, each strand seemingly alive with its own luminescence. Her skin had become translucent to the point where her internal organs were clearly visible, pulsing with rhythms that bore no relationship to any earthly heartbeat. Most disturbing of all were her eyes. The corneas had become multifaceted like those of an insect, yet they retained an unmistakable intelligence that seemed to perceive dimensions beyond normal human perception. As Holmes examined the body, those alien organs tracked his movements with an awareness that belonged to no corpse I had ever encountered. "Holmes," I whispered, my medical training warring with my sanity as I observed phenomena that contradicted every principle of human biology. "This transformation follows a pattern different from Lord Pemberton's. Where his changes suggested accelerated aging, hers appeared to represent evolution, as if she had been altered to serve some function we cannot comprehend." Holmes nodded grimly, his examination revealing details that filled me with mounting horror. Mrs. Blackwood's fingers had elongated into appendages better suited for manipulating objects of impossible geometry, and her spine had developed additional vertebrae that allowed movements no human skeleton should accommodate. "Watson," he said, his voice tight with controlled fear, "observe the books surrounding her body. Note their positions, their orientations." The volumes that had fallen from the shelves during whatever cosmic event had claimed Mrs. Blackwood's life lay scattered around her chair in patterns that hurt to perceive directly. Their pages had fallen open to reveal text that seemed to shift and crawl across the paper, and from their bindings came sounds resembling distant sobbing, mixed with something that might have been laughter. "The knowledge is spreading," Holmes continued, his usual analytical tone giving way to something approaching panic. "Each death creates new pathways for the contagion to follow, new vectors through which this cosmic infection can establish itself in our reality." Inspector Lestrade arrived as we completed our initial examination, his appearance providing stark evidence of the toll these investigations were taking upon all involved. His hair, which had been sandy brown upon our first meeting, now showed streaks of premature gray, and his eyes held depths of knowledge that no Metropolitan Police inspector should possess. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice carrying a tremor that spoke of sanity balanced upon a knife's edge, "there's been another development. 3 more villagers have reported experiencing episodes. Dreams, they claim, though their descriptions suggest experiences far more vivid than any normal sleep could produce." "Describe these episodes," Holmes commanded, his notebook already in hand. "They speak of vast cities that exist beneath the earth, populated by beings whose very existence defies physical law. Architectural structures that incorporate dimensions beyond the 3 we know, and rituals being performed in preparation for some event they describe as, quote, the Great Opening. The words struck me like physical blows, each syllable confirming fears I had not dared to articulate. Holmes's behavior over the past days suddenly made terrible sense. He had not been descending into madness, as I had feared, but had been fighting to maintain his sanity in the face of revelations that would have shattered lesser minds entirely. "Watson," he said, turning to me with eyes that held depths of desperation I had never seen before, "we are witnessing the preliminary stages of an invasion, not by any earthly force, but by entities whose very existence threatens the fundamental structure of reality itself. Each death, each transformation weakens the barriers that separate our dimension from realms where different laws of physics hold sway." As if to punctuate his words, a sound drifted through the library's windows from somewhere in the village beyond. It began as a low humming, barely audible, but gradually grew in intensity and complexity, until it resembled nothing so much as a choir of voices singing in harmonies that human throats were never designed to produce. The sound filled me with terror so profound that I found myself unable to move, unable even to breathe, as something vast and alien turned its attention toward our small corner of the universe. Holmes rose from his examination with movements that seemed almost mechanical, his face bearing an expression of terrible understanding. "It has begun in earnest, Watson. The forces we glimpsed in Lord Pemberton's study have established their foothold. Unless we can identify and disrupt their methodology, Whitmore will become the epicenter of a transformation that will spread across the globe like wildfire." "What do you propose we do?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. "We must descend into the library's basement levels, Watson. Whatever Mrs. Blackwood discovered in those depths, whatever knowledge cost her humanity itself, holds the key to understanding our enemy. Only by comprehending the nature of the threat can we hope to devise a means of combating it." As we prepared to descend into the bowels of the ancient library, I reflected upon how completely our world had changed in the span of mere days. The comfortable certainties of rational existence had been swept away, replaced by realities that challenged every assumption about the nature of existence itself. Yet somehow, in the face of cosmic horror beyond human comprehension, I found myself drawing strength from the one constant that remained unchanged: my faith in Sherlock Holmes and his ability to find patterns of logic even in the heart of absolute chaos. The basement of the Whitmore Public Library descended far deeper into the earth than any village institution should require, its stone steps worn smooth by centuries of passage, yet bearing tool marks that suggested construction methods unknown to any historical period. As we made our way downward by lantern light, the temperature dropped with each level we traversed, until our breath formed visible clouds in air that seemed to thicken with accumulated secrets. "Holmes," I murmured as we reached what appeared to be the third sublevel. "The architecture here predates the building above by centuries. These chambers were not constructed to house books in any conventional sense." Holmes paused in his descent, running his fingers along stone walls whose surfaces bore carvings that seemed to shift and flow when viewed by flickering lamplight. "Indeed, Watson, we are walking through foundations that were ancient when the Romans first set foot upon British soil. Whatever purpose these chambers originally served, their current function represents a perversion of knowledge that should never have been attempted. The restricted collection occupied a series of interconnected chambers that burrowed into the hillside like the warren of some impossibly large creature. The air itself possessed a weight that pressed against both mind and body, and I found myself struggling to draw breath as we ventured deeper into this subterranean archive of forbidden wisdom. The books themselves defied rational description. Volumes bound in materials that had never belonged to any earthly creature lined shelves that extended beyond the reach of our lamplight, their titles writhing and changing even as we attempted to read them. From their pages came sounds that resembled distant weeping, mixed with something that might have been prayer in languages that predated human speech. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "observe the pattern of dust disturbance upon these shelves. Certain volumes have been handled recently, their positions altered by hands seeking specific information. Following the trail of evidence with the methodical precision that had served us well in countless investigations, we identified the books that had drawn Mrs. Blackwood's fatal attention. Chief among them was a volume whose bindings seemed to be composed of scales that reflected light in impossible spectrums, its title written in symbols that appeared to exist in more than 3 dimensions. When Holmes opened the tome, Its pages revealed diagrams that depicted geometric forms whose angles should not have been able to exist within the confines of normal space. Mathematical formulae covered the margins, equations that seemed to describe relationships between concepts that had no names in any human language. Most disturbing of all were the anatomical illustrations, drawings that showed the human form undergoing transformations that followed patterns we had observed in both Lord Pemberton and Mrs. Blackwood. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice tight with controlled excitement, "I believe we have discovered the source of Whitmore's affliction. This volume contains detailed instructions for a process its authors term dimensional harmonization, a procedure designed to alter human consciousness and physiology to serve as conduits for entities existing in parallel realities." As I studied the Eldritch diagrams over his shoulder, a pattern began to emerge from the chaos of impossible knowledge. The transformations we had witnessed were not random mutations, but carefully orchestrated changes designed to create human vessels capable of housing alien consciousness. Each death had been both sacrifice and preparation, bringing something vast and malevolent closer to full manifestation in our world. "The ritual requires specific conditions," Holmes continued, his understanding crystallizing with terrifying clarity. "Participants who have been exposed to this knowledge, astronomical alignments that occur at precise intervals, and physical preparations that explain the geometric patterns we observed in Lord Pemberton's study." He turned pages that seemed to resist his touch, revealing star charts that depicted celestial configurations no earthly astronomer had ever recorded. According to the calculations detailed within, the final phase of the ritual was scheduled to coincide with an alignment that occurred only once every 2,847 years, an event that would take place in less than 36 hours. "The timing is not coincidental, Watson. Whatever intelligence orchestrated this sequence of events has been planning for millennia, waiting for the precise moment when the barriers between dimensions would be at their weakest." Mrs. Blackwood's transformation was not simply a death but a graduation. Her consciousness adapted to serve as a beacon for entities seeking entry into our reality. As we delved deeper into the forbidden text, I became aware of movement in the shadows that gathered beyond our circle of lamplight. Shapes that possessed no fixed form seemed to writhe just beyond the edge of perception, and from somewhere in the darkness came sounds of breathing that belonged to no earthly creature. "Holmes," I said, my voice steady despite the terror that clawed at my sanity, "we are no longer alone in these chambers." He looked up from his examination of the ancient tome, his eyes reflecting our lantern's flame in ways that seemed somehow inhuman. "No, Watson, we are not. The knowledge contained within these volumes acts as a form of psychic beacon, drawing the attention of entities that exist in the spaces between realities. Our very presence here, our exposure to this information, has made us visible to consciousness that should never have become aware of our existence." The shadows around us began to coalesce into forms that challenged every assumption about the nature of physical matter. Appendages that were simultaneously tentacles and geometric concepts reached toward us with movements that seemed to occur in more than 3 dimensions, while voices that spoke in harmonies impossible for human hearing whispered suggestions in languages that bypassed rational thought entirely. "We must depart immediately," Holmes said, closing the blasphemous volume with movements that seemed to require tremendous effort. "Prolonged exposure to this knowledge will complete the transformation process that has already begun within us. We have learned what we came to discover, but the price of that learning may yet prove higher than we can afford to pay." As we fled through the labyrinthine passages toward the surface, I caught glimpses of other chambers whose contents filled me with revulsion beyond description. Specimens preserved in fluids that defied chemical classification, artifacts whose very existence seemed to bend space around them, and inscriptions that hurt to perceive directly covered every available surface. We emerged into the library's main level, gasping like drowning men who had finally reached air, though the relief we felt was tempered by the knowledge that our brief exposure to those forbidden depths had altered us in ways we were only beginning to comprehend. Holmes's hands shook as he attempted to light his pipe, and I noticed that my own reflection in the library's window seemed somehow different, as if my features had been subtly rearranged by forces beyond my understanding. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice carrying a tremor that spoke of sanity balanced upon a razor's edge, "we now possess the knowledge necessary to prevent this cosmic catastrophe, but the price of that knowledge may be our own humanity. The ritual can be disrupted, the dimensional barriers reinforced, but only through methods that will require us to venture even deeper into realms where human consciousness was never meant to tread." It was Watson who pulled me back from the abyss into which my rational mind threatened to plummet. As I sat in our hotel room that evening, surrounded by pages covered in symbols that seemed to burn themselves into my retinas, my steadfast companion approached with the careful deliberation of a physician treating a patient balanced upon the precipice of madness. "Holmes," he said, his voice carrying the authority I remembered from his military service, "you must cease this self-destructive examination of forbidden knowledge. You have not failed as a detective. Your methods have not proven inadequate. You have simply encountered a problem that requires expansion of your investigative framework rather than abandonment of it." I looked up at him, my hands still trembling from hours spent transcribing passages that no human mind should contain. "Watson, you do not comprehend the magnitude of what we face. These entities exist beyond the boundaries of physical law, operate according to principles that render human reason obsolete. Everything I have built my career upon, every assumption I have made about the nature of reality itself, has proven insufficient to address this cosmic horror." Watson settled into the chair across from me, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "Has it? Or have you simply been attempting to apply terrestrial logic to extraterrestrial phenomena? Holmes, you have always maintained that, when you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains must be true, regardless of how improbable it might appear. What if our error lies not in our methodology, but in our definition of impossibility itself?" His words struck me with the force of revelation. For days I had been attempting to force supernatural occurrences into the rigid framework of conventional logic, like trying to measure an ocean with a teaspoon. The solution lay not in abandoning reason, but in expanding it to encompass realities I had never previously considered. "You suggest that I should accept the existence of cosmic entities, of dimensional barriers, of forces that transcend human understanding?" "I suggest," Watson replied with characteristic practicality, "that you should apply the same rigorous observation and analysis to these phenomena that you have always brought to conventional mysteries. The fact that the evidence points towards supernatural causation does not invalidate your deductive methods. It simply expands the scope of possible explanations." I felt something within me settle back into familiar patterns, like a dislocated joint returning to its proper position. Watson was correct, of course. My error had been not in my methodology, but in my assumptions about the nature of existence. If ancient powers were manifesting in Whitmore, they could be studied, their patterns identified, their weaknesses discovered and exploited. "You are quite right, old friend," I said, feeling the familiar clarity of purpose returning to my thoughts. "These entities, whatever their origin or nature, have chosen to operate within our physical reality. That decision subjects them to certain limitations, binds them to specific conditions that can be observed and understood." "Precisely. The question now becomes, what are those conditions, and how can we exploit them?" Over the following hours, Watson and I worked together to construct a new framework for understanding the events in Whitmore. We approached the supernatural elements with the same careful attention to detail we would apply to any criminal enterprise, cataloging evidence, identifying patterns, and formulating hypotheses that could be tested against observable phenomena. Watson's medical training proved invaluable in this process. Where I had seen only impossible transformations, he identified biological processes that, while accelerated beyond natural limits, followed recognizable pathways. The aging effects were not random, but proceeded according to specific sequences, suggesting that whatever force was responsible operated according to consistent principles rather than arbitrary malevolence. "Observe these sketches, Holmes," he said, indicating drawings he had made of the various victims. "The physical changes follow a predictable progression. Hair whitening and growth occur first, followed by skin deterioration and the development of cataracts. The fingernail elongation happens in the final stages, along with the more dramatic anatomical alterations. It's as if time itself is being weaponized against these individuals." "But why these particular victims?" I mused. Lord Pemberton and Mrs. Blackwood shared certain characteristics beyond their connection to forbidden knowledge. What made them susceptible to this temporal acceleration while others remained unaffected? Watson consulted his notes, his methodical approach providing structure to our investigation. According to the information we've gathered, both victims had recently experienced significant exposure to the texts housed in the library's basement. But more than that, both had attempted to share their discoveries with others. Lord Pemberton had been corresponding with scholars across Europe, while Mrs. Blackwood had been cataloging the collection for potential researchers. "The spreading of knowledge," I said, understanding beginning to crystallize. They were not simply victims, but vectors, chosen specifically because their positions would allow the contamination to spread beyond Whitmore's boundaries. Each person they contacted, each letter they wrote, each conversation they held about their discoveries, created new pathways for the contagion to follow. The pattern was becoming clear, and with it a possible strategy for intervention. The entities we faced were not omnipotent, but operated according to rules that could be understood and countered. They required human consciousness as a bridging mechanism, needed willing or unwitting participants to establish their foothold in our reality. "Watson," I said, rising from my chair with renewed energy, "I believe we have identified both the mechanism of invasion and its primary weakness. These cosmic forces require human intermediaries to manifest in our dimension. If we can disrupt the process by which they recruit and transform these intermediaries, we can prevent the completion of their ritual," Watson finished. "But how do we identify and protect potential victims before the transformation process begins?" "By understanding the selection criteria. The entities are not choosing randomly, but are targeting individuals who possess specific qualifications, access to forbidden knowledge, positions that allow them to disseminate information, and perhaps most importantly, minds capable of comprehending cosmic truths without immediately succumbing to madness." The implications were sobering. By our very investigation of these phenomena, Watson and I had made ourselves prime candidates for recruitment. Our exposure to the basement archives, our growing understanding of the entity's methodology, our positions as consulting detectives with connections throughout the civilized world, all marked us as ideal vectors for their purposes. "Then we must act quickly," Watson said, his military training asserting itself in the face of clear and present danger. "If we are correct about the timing of their final ritual, we have less than 24 hours to implement whatever countermeasures we can devise." "Indeed. And our first priority must be to prevent any additional transformations from occurring. Each new victim strengthens their position and weakens our own. We must identify and isolate any villagers who have been exposed to the contaminating knowledge before they can be converted into cosmic conduits." As we prepared to venture back into Whitmore's increasingly alien streets, I reflected upon the curious turns our investigation had taken. What had begun as a seemingly impossible medical mystery had evolved into something approaching a military campaign, with the fate of human consciousness itself hanging in the balance. Yet rather than feeling overwhelmed by the cosmic scope of our adversary, I found myself energized by the intellectual challenge it represented. The game, as I had always said, was afoot. The fact that our opponent existed beyond the normal boundaries of space and time merely made the contest more intriguing. Dawn brought revelations that confirmed our worst fears while simultaneously providing the key to our salvation. As Watson and I made our rounds through Whitmore, interviewing villagers and documenting symptoms of exposure to the cosmic contagion, we discovered that the contamination had spread far more widely than we had initially suspected. Mrs. Cromwell, the baker's wife, reported dreams of vast underwater cities, populated by beings that communicated through colors rather than sounds. Young Timothy Fletcher, the blacksmith's apprentice, described visions of geometric forms that existed in spaces between the spaces, architectural impossibilities that hurt to contemplate yet seemed more real than the physical world around him. Most disturbing of all was the village postmaster, Mr. Hartfield, who had begun incorporating alien symbols into his official correspondence without conscious awareness of doing so. "The pattern is insidious," I observed as we documented each case of exposure. "Rather than transforming victims immediately, the entities are allowing the contamination to incubate, creating a network of infected minds that will undergo simultaneous conversion at the moment of the ritual's completion." Watson examined the symptoms with his characteristic medical precision, noting subtle changes that would have escaped less trained observation. "The physical manifestations are minimal thus far, but consistent. Slight elongation of the fingernails, premature graying of hair around the temples, and most significantly, alterations in the structure of the iris that suggest developing sensitivity to light spectrums beyond normal human perception." We had established our temporary headquarters in the village inn, converting the common room into an impromptu medical facility where we could examine potential victims without attracting unwanted attention. The innkeeper, Mr. Whitman, had initially resisted our commandeering of his establishment, but his objections ceased abruptly when Watson demonstrated the changes occurring in his own reflection. "Look closely at your eyes, Mr. Whitman," Watson instructed, holding a mirror before the man's face. Notice the small flecks of color that were not present a week ago? The way certain shadows seem to reveal details that should not be visible? The innkeeper's face went pale as he observed the alien modifications taking place within his own body. "Good Lord," he whispered, his voice trembling with the realization of his condition. "What is happening to us? What are we becoming?" "You are being prepared," I explained, attempting to maintain a clinical tone despite the horror of the situation. "The entities responsible for these changes require human consciousness to serve as anchoring points for their manifestation in our reality. Each modification makes you more suitable for that purpose, more capable of housing intelligences that operate according to non-human logic." Over the course of the morning, we identified 17 villagers, showing varying degrees of contamination, each case representing a different stage in the transformation process. The pattern suggested careful planning and precise timing, with the most severely affected individuals scheduled to undergo complete conversion as the astronomical alignment reached its peak. "Holmes," Watson said, studying the progression charts we had compiled, "if our calculations are correct, the final phase will begin at sunset tonight. We have perhaps 10 hours to devise and implement a method of disruption that can save not only Whitmore, but prevent this contagion from spreading to the wider world." The weight of responsibility pressed upon us like a physical burden. 17 lives hung in the balance, along with the sanity of anyone who might subsequently encounter the entities once they achieved full manifestation. Yet as I studied our accumulated evidence, I began to perceive the outline of a solution. "Watson, observe the geographical distribution of the affected individuals. They are not scattered randomly throughout the village, but follow specific lines of connection. Mrs. Cromwell lives adjacent to the library. Timothy Fletcher's forge sits directly above one of the ancient stone foundations we observed in the basement levels. Mr. Hartfield's post office occupies the site of Whitmore's original church, built upon ruins that predate Christian settlement. You're suggesting that the contamination follows ley lines of some sort? Ancient pathways that focus and direct the entity's influence? Precisely. And if that influence can be focused and directed, it can also be disrupted and redirected. The ritual requires precise coordination between multiple elements: the astronomical alignment, the prepared human vessels, and most crucially, the geometric patterns that channel cosmic forces into our dimensional space. I pulled out the sketches we had made of the stains in Lord Pemberton's study, comparing them with similar markings we had discovered at each subsequent transformation site. The patterns were identical in their mathematical relationships but varied in their specific implementation, suggesting a grand design that encompassed the entire village. "Watson, I believe the entirety of Whitmore has been converted into a single massive ritual circle, with each building occupying a specific position within a geometric pattern too large to perceive from ground level. The individual transformations we have witnessed were not separate events, but components of a single vast ceremony. The implications were staggering. The entities had been planning this manifestation for far longer than we had suspected, possibly for centuries, carefully positioning their human agents and preparing the necessary infrastructure with patience that spoke of intelligence operating on cosmic timescales. "Then how do we disrupt something of such magnitude?" Watson asked, though his tone suggested he was already beginning to perceive the answer. "By identifying the pattern's focal point and introducing a disruption that will propagate throughout the entire system. Every geometric design, no matter how complex, possesses critical nodes whose alteration affects the structure as a whole. We must find Whitmore's equivalent of a keystone and remove it before the ritual reaches completion." As we studied our maps and measurements, searching for the mathematical center of the village-wide pattern, a commotion erupted in the street outside our makeshift headquarters. Through the inn's windows, we observed a procession of figures, moving with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, their eyes reflecting light that belonged to no earthly source. "It has begun," I said, rising from our work table with grim determination. "The final phase of the ritual is commencing ahead of schedule. We must act immediately, or all our preparations will prove meaningless." The 17 contaminated villagers had begun to converge upon a single location, their movements coordinated by intelligence that operated beyond individual consciousness. As they gathered in the village square, I realized with horrifying clarity that we had discovered our target. The church, Watson. The original church that predates the current structure by centuries. That is where the pattern converges, where the focal point of their geometric design has been established. If we can reach that location before the transformation completes, we can disrupt the entire ritual, Watson finished, checking his service revolver with practiced efficiency. "But Holmes, what you're proposing requires us to place ourselves at the very center of the cosmic forces we're attempting to thwart. The exposure could prove fatal." The alternative is the end of human civilization as we understand it, Watson. When measured against such stakes, our personal survival becomes a secondary consideration. As we prepared to venture into the gathering maelstrom of supernatural forces, I reflected upon the strange turns our investigation had taken. We had begun as detectives attempting to solve an impossible medical mystery, and had evolved into something approaching cosmic warriors, standing guard at the threshold between dimensions to prevent horrors beyond imagination from establishing dominion over our world. The rational mind, when properly applied and courageously wielded, remained humanity's greatest defense against the darkness that lurked beyond the stars. And as long as Watson and I drew breath, that defense would not falter. The original church of Whitmore lay beneath the current structure, like a buried secret, accessible only through a narrow passage that descended from behind the altar into chambers that predated Christian doctrine by millennia. As Watson and I made our way through tunnels carved from living rock, the very air seemed to thicken with accumulated malevolence, and our lanterns cast shadows that moved independently of our progress. "Holmes," Watson murmured, his voice barely audible above the distant chanting that echoed through the stone corridors. "The architecture here follows the same impossible principles we observed in the library's basement. These passages exist in defiance of the building's external dimensions." Indeed, we had been descending for far longer than the church's foundation should have allowed, yet our path continued to spiral downward into depths that seemed to extend to the very core of the earth. The walls bore inscriptions in languages that predated human speech, their symbols writhing and shifting when viewed by flickering lamplight, and from somewhere far below came sounds that resembled breathing, mixed with something that might have been cosmic laughter. We emerged at last into a vast chamber, whose dimensions challenged every assumption about space and perspective. The ceiling soared to heights lost in shadows that gathered despite our illumination, while the floor spread outward in directions that seemed to incorporate more than 3 dimensions. At the chamber's center lay a circular depression carved with geometric patterns of staggering complexity, their mathematical relationships creating optical illusions that made my eyes water to perceive directly. "The focal point," I breathed, recognizing the culmination of the pattern we had traced throughout Whitmore. "This is where all the village's ley lines converge, where the cosmic forces are concentrated and channeled into our dimensional space." The 17 contaminated villagers had arranged themselves around the circle's perimeter, their movements coordinated with inhuman precision as they assumed positions that corresponded to specific astronomical bodies. Mrs. Cromwell stood at what I calculated to be the position of Venus, while Timothy Fletcher occupied the node representing Mars. Each figure swayed in rhythm, with forces that operated beyond normal perception, their eyes reflecting light from sources that existed in parallel realities. At the circle's exact center stood a figure that had once been Mrs. Whitlock, though her transformation had progressed far beyond anything we had previously witnessed. Her human form had been stretched and distorted, until she resembled some grotesque hybrid of woman and cosmic geometry, her limbs elongated into appendages that traced patterns in the air while her mouth moved in syllables that belonged to no earthly language. "Watson," I whispered, studying the ritual's progression with growing urgency. "Observe the positioning of the participants. They form a precise mathematical mandala designed to channel forces from multiple dimensional sources simultaneously. If we can disrupt even one node of this pattern, the entire structure will collapse," he finished, raising his service revolver with practiced steadiness. "Which position should we target?" I calculated rapidly, applying geometric principles to determine the pattern's most vulnerable point. "The figure at the Saturn position, there, to the northeast. That node serves as the primary stabilizing element for the entire configuration. Remove it, and the cosmic forces will become uncontrolled, turning destructive rather than constructive." Watson took careful aim, his military training evident in the economy of his movements. Yet as he prepared to fire, the air within the chamber began to shimmer with increasing intensity, and through the developing dimensional rift, shapes of impossible magnitude pressed against the barriers that separated our reality from the void beyond. "Too late," Mrs. Whitlock's voice echoed through the chamber, though her words seemed to arrive from multiple directions simultaneously. "The great opening has begun. Yog-Sothoth stirs in the spaces between spaces, and soon all barriers will dissolve into nothingness." The ritual circle pulsed with energies that made the very stone beneath our feet vibrate, with harmonics that resonated in frequencies beyond human hearing. The air above the pattern rippled like water, and through that dimensional disturbance, appendages that were simultaneously tentacles and mathematical concepts began to probe our reality with movements that occurred in more than 3 dimensions. "Now, Watson," I shouted above the rising cosmic cacophony, "before the manifestation completes." The shot rang out like thunder in the confined space, and the villager occupying the Saturn position crumpled to the ancient stone floor. The effect upon the ritual was immediate and catastrophic. The geometric patterns carved into the chamber floor began to crack and smoke, their mathematical precision disrupted by the sudden imbalance in the cosmic configuration. Yet our intervention had come perilously close to the point of no return. The entity pressing against our dimensional barriers had already achieved partial manifestation, its alien consciousness touching our reality with force sufficient to warp space itself. The chamber's walls buckled and writhed as competing geometries struggled for dominance, and the remaining ritual participants began to undergo transformations that defied every principle of human biology. "Holmes!" Watson cried, pointing toward the far wall where the stone had begun to bubble and flow like liquid. "The chamber is becoming unstable. We must evacuate immediately." But even as he spoke, I realized that simple evacuation would not suffice. The damage to our dimensional barriers had been too severe, the ritual too nearly completed. Unless we could find some method of sealing the rift that had been torn in reality's fabric, the entity's influence would continue to spread, converting first Whitmore, then the surrounding countryside, and eventually the entire world into a realm suitable for its alien purposes. "Watson, the inscriptions on the walls, they're not simply decorative but functional elements of the containment system. If we can activate the original binding spells." I rushed to the nearest wall, studying the ancient symbols with desperate intensity. The language was older than any human civilization, yet certain patterns seemed familiar from our study of the forbidden texts in the library's basement. Mathematical relationships that described methods of dimensional reinforcement, techniques for strengthening the barriers between realities. But Holmes, how do we activate spells written in languages we cannot read, utilizing principles of magic we barely comprehend? Through application of the same logical methodology we have always employed, Watson. These symbols represent a form of advanced mathematics, equations that describe the fundamental structure of reality itself. If we can solve the mathematical puzzle they present, working with frantic efficiency, I began to trace connections between symbols, identifying recurring patterns and mathematical relationships. The ancient builders of this chamber had created not merely a ritual space, but a dimensional lock, a mechanism designed to prevent exactly the sort of incursion we were witnessing. Here, Watson, this sequence describes a geometric inversion that would reverse the polarity of the dimensional rift. But it requires simultaneous activation of multiple nodes throughout the chamber. Watson studied the pattern I had identified, his practical mind grasping the implementation requirements. A coordinated effort. You take the eastern wall, I'll handle the western sequence. But Holmes, what assurance do we have that this will work? That we're not simply accelerating our own destruction? None whatsoever, I admitted, beginning to trace the required patterns upon the ancient stone. But the alternative is certain doom for our entire reality. Better to risk everything on a chance of salvation than to surrender without resistance. As we activated the dimensional locks with movements that felt more like conducting a cosmic orchestra than performing any earthly ritual, the chamber's atmosphere began to stabilize. The rift above the ritual circle, which had been expanding with each passing moment, suddenly contracted with audible force, and the alien appendages that had been probing our reality withdrew as if burned. The entity's scream of rage and frustration echoed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, a sound that spoke of cosmic plans millennia in the making, brought to ruin by the intervention of 2 mortal investigators. The remaining ritual participants collapsed as the alien consciousness that had been directing their movements was forcibly severed from our dimensional space, and the chamber's impossible geometries snapped back to configurations that human minds could safely perceive. "Watson," I said, slumping against the wall as the immediate crisis passed, "I believe we have achieved something approaching victory. The immediate threat has been contained, the dimensional barriers reinforced, and the entity's manifestation prevented." "But for how long?" Watson asked, his medical training allowing him to recognize that our triumph was likely temporary. "Such cosmic forces do not surrender easily, and they possess patience measured in geological ages. Long enough, I hope, for us to establish more permanent defenses. The knowledge we have gained through this investigation, terrible though it may be, provides humanity with its first real understanding of the threats that lurk beyond the stars. Armed with that knowledge, we can begin to prepare for future incursions. As we made our way back through the tunnels toward the surface world, I reflected upon the profound changes our investigation had wrought. We had entered Whitmore as conventional detectives, investigating an impossible crime, and emerged as guardians of reality itself, standing watch at the threshold between dimensions to protect humanity from horrors it could never comprehend. The rational mind, when expanded to encompass cosmic truths, remained our species' greatest defense against the darkness. And as long as individuals remained willing to confront the impossible with courage and intelligence, that defense would endure. 6 months have passed since our confrontation with the cosmic horror that sought to manifest itself in Whitmore, and the village has begun to show signs of gradual recovery from its supernatural ordeal. The 17 contaminated villagers survived their exposure to alien influence, though each bears subtle changes that serve as permanent reminders of their brush with otherworldly forces. Mrs. Cromwell's eyes now perceive colors that exist beyond normal human vision, while Timothy Fletcher's enhanced strength allows him to work metal in ways that defy conventional understanding of metallurgy. Dr. Hartwell has documented these lingering effects with scientific precision, creating the first comprehensive medical study of human exposure to cosmic radiation. His research, while necessarily classified to prevent panic among the general population, has provided invaluable insights into the biological mechanisms through which extra-dimensional entities interact with terrestrial life forms. Mrs. Whitlock, restored to her human form but retaining memories of her transformation, has agreed to serve as the primary guardian of Whitmore's dimensional stability. Her unique experience allows her to detect the earliest signs of otherworldly influence, making her our first line of defense against future incursions. The basement archive of forbidden knowledge remains under her protection, its contents studied by carefully selected scholars who possess both the intellectual capacity to comprehend cosmic truths and the psychological resilience to avoid contamination. The knowledge cannot be destroyed, she explained during one of our periodic visits to monitor the situation. These truths exist across multiple realities simultaneously, and eliminating them from our dimension would accomplish nothing. Instead, we must learn to coexist with dangerous wisdom, to study it without being consumed by it. Holmes and I have established what we term the Dimensional Defense Initiative, a network of observers trained to recognize and respond to supernatural threats wherever they may manifest. Our methodology combines traditional investigative techniques with expanded understanding of cosmic phenomena, creating a hybrid approach that remains grounded in rational thought while acknowledging realities that transcend normal human experience. The cases that come to our attention have grown increasingly exotic, as word of our expertise spreads through carefully guarded channels. We have investigated disappearances that involve dimensional displacement, solved murders committed by entities that exist partially outside normal space-time, and prevented rituals designed to weaken the barriers between realities. Each case expands our understanding, while reinforcing the vital importance of our ongoing vigil. Watson, Holmes observed during a recent evening at 221 B. Baker Street, our investigation in Whitmore marked the beginning of a new phase in human development. For the first time in our species' history, we possess genuine knowledge of the forces that operate beyond our dimensional boundaries. That knowledge brings both tremendous opportunity and equally tremendous responsibility. The criminal underworld of London has begun to incorporate elements that exist on the borderlands between conventional crime and cosmic horror. We have encountered cult leaders who traffic in alien mathematics, thieves who steal objects from parallel dimensions, and murderers who utilize weapons that operate according to non-Euclidean principles. Each case requires adaptation of our methods, expansion of our toolkit, and careful balance between rational investigation and supernatural understanding. Yet perhaps the most significant change has been in Holmes himself. The experience of having his worldview challenged and expanded has enhanced rather than diminished his legendary capabilities. His deductive powers now encompass possibilities that would have seemed impossible during our earlier adventures, while his fundamental commitment to truth and justice remains unshakable. He has become, in essence, the detective our strange new world requires. "The game continues, Watson," he said recently, studying a case file that described geometric murders in Edinburgh. "But the rules have expanded to encompass realities we are only beginning to comprehend. The rational mind, when properly applied, remains our greatest weapon against the darkness. We need only ensure that our definition of rationality remains flexible enough to accommodate truths that challenge every assumption about the nature of existence. The fog that shrouds London on certain nights still carries whispers of otherworldly threats, and the shadows that gather in forgotten corners of the city sometimes conceal dangers that would drive lesser minds to madness. Yet we remain prepared, armed with knowledge hard-won through direct confrontation with cosmic horror, ready to respond whenever the barriers between dimensions grow thin. Our files grow thicker with each passing month, documenting encounters with entities whose names cannot be safely written, and phenomena that challenge the fundamental structure of reality itself. Yet rather than being overwhelmed by the magnitude of the threats we face, we find ourselves energized by the intellectual challenges they present. The rational mind, when courageously applied and intelligently expanded, remains humanity's greatest defense against forces that would reduce our reality to chaos. And as long as individuals remain willing to stand guard at the threshold between dimensions, armed with logic, courage, and an unshakable commitment to protecting the innocent, that defense shall not fail. In the words that have become our unofficial motto, the game, as always, continues. But now we play for stakes that encompass not merely justice for the wronged, but the very survival of rational thought in a universe where madness lurks beyond every star. The eternal vigil has begun, and we shall not rest while shadows threaten the light of human reason.